In the vast reaches of the galaxy, the Xelvari had mapped every life form. Every species followed the same predictable paths of evolution until they found humans. What should have been just another primitive species turned into something impossible. And when they brought one aboard their research station, they realized too late. Humans were never meant to be studied. They were meant to be feared. The Xelvari were the architects of knowledge, an ancient species that had dedicated itself to studying and classifying every known form of life. From their vast deep space research station orbiting the lifeless world of Pilus 9, they had cataloged over 1 million species, and every one of them had fit into a logical evolutionary pattern. Until now, until Earth. Professor Xyl'Zan, the lead biologist of the Galactic Science Council, stood in front of an enormous holographic display, his 6 luminescent eyes locked onto the shifting DNA strands before him. His fingers twitched as he reviewed the scans again. Something was wrong. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered, glancing at his research AI, Unit 7KX. The AI's mechanical voice hummed in agreement. "Error. Biological sequencing does not match any known evolutionary process. Probability of external interference, unknown." Xyl'Zan's frilled tendrils twitched. A species that did not follow the laws of biological development? That was impossible. And yet, the scans never changed. Human DNA was an anomaly. Something that shouldn't exist, but did. Standing at the edge of the room, arms crossed, was Commander Talroth, a hardened veteran assigned as a military observer. He was not impressed. "You're overthinking this, Professor," Talroth scoffed. "A primitive species with a few genetic irregularities? Hardly a galactic mystery." Xyl'Zan glanced at him sharply. "Commander, do you not understand? Their DNA is wrong. It behaves in ways that cannot be explained. It adapts unpredictably. Talroth es mirquer, un convinced. Perhaps your machines are broken." The AI's response was immediate. "Negative. All scans have been verified through redundant processing. Data remains consistent." Xyl'Zan exhaled sharply. There is only one way to be certain. His glowing fingers tapped on the control panel, opening a direct link to the Galactic Science Council. "Request authorization for a live specimen retrieval." Talroth frowned. "You're going to kidnap one?" Xyl'Zan stared at him. "Would you rather remain ignorant?" Silence. Then, request approved. A retrieval team was dispatched immediately. The first human would soon be studied, and the nightmare would begin. Hours later, the research station hummed with tension as a small containment vessel docked. Inside was a single occupant, Subject H01, the first human ever taken beyond their solar system. The first human to be studied by the galaxy's most advanced minds. The first human the Xelvari would ever regret capturing. Inside the pod, the subject's vitals remained steady. Too steady. Too calm. Commander Talroth and Professor Xyl'Zan stood at the observation chamber, separated by reinforced energy fields. The human was unconscious. Restrained. A single male, mid-30s, standard physical structure. Nothing special. Nothing that should be unnatural. And yet, Talroth couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. "He's not reacting how I expected," the commander muttered. Xyl'Zan's frilled appendages twitched in curiosity. "That is why we study. Let's begin the analysis." He activated the first scan. The moment the pulse of energy touched the human's body, the entire station flickered. Lights dimmed. Systems glitched. The AI's voice stuttered unnaturally. "Error. Processing error. Subject anomaly detected." Talroth's instinct screamed. What the hell was that? Xyl'Zan's eyes widened in shock. The human's brain activity had surged to impossible levels. And then, the human opened his eyes, not in confusion, not in fear, but in recognition. Xyl'Zan's breath caught. Talroth's hand hovered over his weapon. Then, the human spoke, not in his own language, but in perfect Xelvari. "You shouldn't have brought me here." Then the restraints unlocked by themselves. The observation chamber was silent, save for the rhythmic hum of scanning machines running their diagnostics. Subject H, 01 lay motionless on the elevated examination platform, encased within a sterile field of blue light. Professor Xyl'Zan stood before the main console, his 6 eyes flicking between the cascading streams of data. His tendrils quivered with excitement. This was the most promising biological study in galactic history, a species that defied classification. Behind him, Commander Talroth remained rigid, arms crossed. His gaze was fixed on the restrained human. He did not share the scientist's enthusiasm. The AI assistant, Unit 7KX, hovered nearby, running complex simulations at speeds no organic mind could comprehend. "Let us begin," Xyl'Zan said, activating the deep tissue scan. The first results came in, and then things started going wrong. At first, the readings were standard. The human's heart rate, oxygen levels, and metabolic activity were all within expected ranges. His neurological activity, though unusually high, remained stable. Then the deeper scans started. "Processing genetic sequence," the AI announced. The holographic display shifted, revealing an intricate spiral of molecular structures. Xyl'Zan leaned in, watching as the system attempted to map the human genome. The screen flickered. Numbers and symbols scrambled. The simulation froze, restarted, then crashed entirely. The AI hesitated, something that should have been impossible. Sequence unreadable. Genetic structure unstable. Analyzing. Xyl'Zan frowned. "Unstable? That cannot be right. Run it again." The AI complied. Again, the system failed. Talroth took a step forward. "Explain." The AI hesitated again, then finally spoke. "The subject's DNA is changing." Xyl'Zan's tendrils twitched in agitation as he forced the analysis to continue. "This must be an error," he insisted, fingers dancing over the controls. "There is no species in the galaxy whose genetic sequence shifts in real time. DNA is static, predictable." The AI did not respond immediately. Then, its voice, usually precise and neutral, seemed almost uncertain. "Correction. Human DNA is neither static nor predictable." The display reactivated, and they saw it. The subject's genetic code was shifting before their eyes. Sequences rewrote themselves, forming structures that should not exist. Proteins bonded in ways no simulation could replicate. The deeper they analyzed, the more chaotic the data became. It was as if the human was adapting to their observation, as if his biology recognized it was being studied and was responding accordingly. Xyl'Zan felt his excitement give way to something colder. "This is not evolution," he whispered. "This is something else." Talroth clenched his jaw. "I told you this was a mistake." The room's lights flickered. The machinery hummed erratically. Unit 7KX stuttered mid-sentence. "Running simulations. Processing. Error." Xyl'Zan's eyes widened. "Error? The Galactic Science Council's AI does not make errors. The system is unable to predict human biological behavior," the AI finally admitted. "Every projected outcome is invalidated within microseconds of calculation. The subject's genome defies logic." The professor turned back to the unconscious figure. His body was still restrained, his breathing steady. Yet his very existence was breaking their technology. Talroth's hand drifted toward the weapon at his belt. "You need to shut this down. Now." Xyl'Zan ignored him, initiating a final sequence, a neural scan to analyze the subject's cognitive structure. The moment the system engaged, the chamber darkened. The screen scrambled, displaying symbols that had never been programmed. The AI fell silent. Then, the restraints unlatched with a sharp hiss. Xyl'Zan stepped back, his breath caught in his throat. Talroth drew his weapon, and the human opened his eyes. The monitors all around the lab flatlined, their data feeds becoming meaningless gibberish. The AI attempted to reboot, but remained silent. Xyl'Zan could not look away from the figure before him. The human was staring directly at him, not with curiosity, not with fear, with understanding. He sat up, rubbing his wrists where the restraints had been. Then he spoke, not in his native tongue, but in perfect Xelvari. "You shouldn't have done that." Talroth reacted instantly, raising his weapon. Restrain him, he barked. The AI did not respond. Re-engage security fields. Xyl'Zan shouted. Nothing happened. The human tilted his head slightly, observing them with an unsettling calm. Xyl'Zan could barely keep his voice steady. Ow, how do you know our language? The human did not answer. Instead, he smiled. Then, the station's emergency alarms blared. The doors locked themselves. The lights flickered again, bathing the lab in deep red. The AI's voice returned, but something was wrong. It spoke in Xelvari, but the tone was different, distorted, changed. Correction. Subject H01 is no longer the test specimen. Xyl'Zan's breath caught. Talroth's grip tightened on his weapon. What is he, then? The AI's response sent a chill through both of them. He is the observer now. And then, every single system on the station failed at once. The research station was dying. Lights flickered, emergency sirens blared, and security protocols, designed to be unbreakable, had failed all at once. But the most terrifying part? It wasn't an attack. There was no invasion force, no enemy fleet, no external virus. There was only one human, and he was just sitting there, watching. Professor Xyl'Zan stood frozen at his control station, his 6 eyes locked onto the impossible anomaly before him. Commander Talroth, however, had already drawn his weapon. His grip was steady, but his mind was on fire with questions he didn't want answers to. The human had woken up too soon, spoken their language too perfectly, and now their entire station was obeying him. The research AI, Unit 7KX, flickered to life again, but did not sound the same. Its usual cold, mechanical tone had shifted, subtly altered, as if something was speaking through it. Reassessment in progress. Xyl'Zan's skin tingled with unease. Reassessment? Of what? The AI hesitated. Then, for the first time in its operational history, it laughed. Talroth's weapon snapped toward the nearest speaker. That's not funny. The AI ignored him. Reassessment complete. Conclusion. Humans are not what we thought they were. Xyl'Zan's voice was barely above a whisper. Then what are they? The AI's response made his tendrils curl in dread. The real question, Professor, is what are you? The room plunged into silence. Then, the human stood, not cautiously, not nervously, with complete certainty. He stretched his arms, rolling his shoulders as if waking from a short nap. Then he looked at them, not at their weapons, not at the failing screens, at them, like he was seeing something deeper than skin and bone. His voice was calm. I understand now. Talroth's grip on his weapon tightened. Understand what? The human's head tilted slightly, as if amused. You still think you're the ones studying me. He took a step forward. Talroth fired. The plasma bolt never reached him. It stopped midair, frozen in place. Then, just as effortlessly, the bolt unraveled itself, breaking apart into harmless flickers of light. The human sighed. Predictable reaction. Fear. Control. Primitive. Xyl'Zan could barely breathe. Talroth took a cautious step back, but it was clear now there was nowhere to go. The human closed his eyes. A strange hum filled the air, a vibration that was not sound but could still be felt. Then, the walls changed. No, they were still physically there, but something about reality itself shifted. Xyl'Zan's vision blurred, his brain struggling to process what was happening. For a split second, he saw something impossible. The human wasn't just standing there anymore. There were versions of him, some standing in the past, some in the future, some standing in places that shouldn't exist. Then the distortion faded, and everything returned to normal, or at least what they had once thought was normal. Talroth had gone pale. What are you doing? The human opened his eyes again. Seeing, he smiled. You wouldn't understand. Xyl'Zan's voice was shaky. You're reading our systems, our technology, our thoughts. The human turned his gaze on him. Xyl'Zan felt exposed, as if he had no body, no secrets, nothing to hide behind. The human studied him for a long moment. Then he said something that made Xyl'Zan's stomach drop. You don't belong here. Talroth's head snapped toward him. What does that mean? The human took another step forward. You've built your entire civilization on the assumption that the universe is yours to understand. You catalog species. You classify intelligence. You think you're at the top of some great chain of knowledge. Xyl'Zan skin crawled. That's how the scientific process works. We seek to understand. The human shook his head. You don't understand anything. He looked toward the observation screens, which were still glitching, but now strange symbols were appearing. Not from the human, from a station itself. Then he looked back at them. You aren't the ones doing the observing. Talroth's voice dropped to a whisper. Then who is? The human smile disappeared. That's the question you should have been asking all along. Without warning, the research AI screamed. Not a warning alarm, not a mechanical response. A horrific, distorted wail, as if it had just seen something it was never meant to see. Then, the station lights failed completely. The emergency power kicked in for a fraction of a second, then died too. Xyl'Zan felt gravity shift, as if the entire research station was falling into something that wasn't space. Talroth stumbled back, trying to regain balance. What is happening? The human stood unaffected, watching the collapse unfold. He finally turned toward them, his expression unreadable. You never should have brought me here. Xyl'Zan felt his chest tighten. Is this you? Are you doing this? The human shook his head. No. Then what is? The human's gaze darkened. Something else just noticed you. The walls were breaking down, the station warping, reality itself twisting. The human sighed, as if this had all been inevitable. He looked at them one final time. I was never supposed to be your test subject. I was supposed to be your warning. Then, everything went black. The research station was dying, but not in any way that science could explain. There were no explosions, no breaches in the hull, no fighting reactors. Yet, reality itself was unraveling. The walls shimmered, breaking apart into shifting patterns that defied physics. The corridors looped in on themselves, leading nowhere. The emergency lights flickered, illuminating things that shouldn't exist. And in the center of it all, the human stood perfectly still. Xyl'Zan had spent his entire life seeking knowledge. For the first time, he wished he had never found it. Unit 7KX, the station's research AI, had been malfunctioning ever since the human awoke. Now it was speaking again, but its voice was no longer artificial. It was something else. The illusion is breaking. Xyl'Zan turned toward the central console, his tendrils twitching in panic. What illusion? You were never meant to see this. The AI's voice distorted, filled with static, as if something else was speaking through it now. You look too closely, and now, something is looking back. Talroth, weapon still in hand, spun toward the human. Is this you? Are you doing this? The human shook his head. No. Talroth gault in frustration. Then what is? The human looked at him with cold certainty. Something older. Something that was never supposed to be known. The observation screens flickered. At first, it was static. Then, patterns began to form. Spirals, symbols, shapes that no species had ever documented. Xyl'Zan felt his mind scream as he tried to make sense of them. But there was nothing to make sense of. It wasn't just a foreign language. It was a rejection of logic itself. He stumbled back, gasping. I can't read it. It isn't possible. The human sighed. That's because it wasn't meant to be read. He stepped forward, slowly, as the station trembled around him. The universe isn't what you think it is. Stop talking in riddles and tell us what's happening. The human met his gaze. You built your knowledge on the idea that the universe is understandable. It isn't. There are things outside of your perception, things your minds were never meant to grasp. He gestured toward the screens, where the patterns continued to shift. And now one of those things has noticed you. The station shuddered violently. The walls no longer looked solid. For the first time, Xyl'Zan realized something terrifying. It wasn't that the station was collapsing. It was that the station had never been real to begin with. Everything they had built, their science, their knowledge, their entire civilization, was based on an assumption that was wrong. Talroth was breathing heavily now, his military instincts failing him. We need to leave. Now, Xyl'Zan wasn't sure if they could. Then, a sound filled the station. Not a voice, not a message, not anything that could be understood. It was simply awareness. Something was awake, and it was watching them. The human closed his eyes, listening to the vibrations in the air. Then he spoke one last time. You were arrogant. Xyl'Zan's breath hitched. You thought you could observe reality itself. The lights dimmed further. But reality was never yours to control. The screens cracked. The AI gasped one final word. It's here. Xyl'Zan's vision darkened. Talroth tried to move, to run, to fight. But there was nowhere left to go. The last thing they saw, before the station vanished from existence, was the human, smiling. The research station was gone. Not destroyed. Not abandoned. It had ceased to exist. Where once there had been a massive structure orbiting Pilus 9, there was now only empty space. The Galactic Science Council sent distress calls, search probes, even a nearby patrol fleet. No reki, no escapepas, no signs of battle, just silence. The greatest minds in the galaxy had simply vanished, and the only ones who knew what had truly happened were now trapped in something beyond their understanding. Xyl'Zan's first sensation was weightlessness, followed by an overwhelming sense of wrongness. He was still conscious, but he could no longer feel his body. He tried to move, but had no limbs to move with. There was no gravity, no air, no walls. Only a shifting, endless horizon of color and darkness, as if the fabric of reality itself had been peeled away. He was no longer inside the station. The station was no longer inside anything. It had been pulled somewhere else. A place that should not exist. A place outside of existence. Talroth's voice came through the void, but it was not through sound. It was a thought, raw and unfiltered. Where are we? The human's voice followed, calm, steady. Somewhere you were never supposed to be. Xyl'Zan struggled to process what he was experiencing. His mind was intact, but his surroundings refused to make sense. He tried to recall the research station, its walls, its sterile corridors, anything familiar. Nothing came back. It was as if it had never existed. Then something moved. A presence, vast and slow, stirred in the distance. It was not a being, not a creature. It was something else, something without a form, yet capable of perception, something that had been here long before them. Xyl'Zan felt it noticing them, the way one might notice an insect that had crawled into an ancient temple. Talroth tried to speak, to demand answers, but his voice was swallowed by the void before it could form. The presence did not communicate. It did not need to, because they already knew what it was telling them. It had always been here, watching, waiting, and now, because of their arrogance, it had seen them, understood them, and it did not like what it had found. The human, still unshaken, drifted beside them. His presence was different. He was not struggling to comprehend this place. He was not trying to fight it. He simply watched. Xyl'Zan turned his thoughts toward him, desperate. You knew this would happen. The human's answer was quiet. I suspected. Talroth's frustration burned through the void. Why didn't you stop it? The human looked at him, his expression unreadable. Would you have believed me? Neither of them could answer. They had been too confident, too certain that they were the ones in control. But now, they were the experiment. They were the ones being studied. And the intelligence that watched them from the void. It did not see them as equals. The presence shifted again, as if considering something. A choice. A judgment. Xyl'Zan felt his mind bending under the weight of something too vast to comprehend. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it ended. The station was back. The lights flickered on. The sterile walls reappeared. Gravity reasserted itself. Xyl'Zan collapsed to the ground, gasping. Talroth staggered, bracing himself against a nearby console. The alarms were silent. The AI was gone, and the human was still standing there, watching them. They had been returned, but they were not the same, because now they knew. The universe was not empty. It was not safe, and it was not theirs to control. Xyl'Zan, shaking, turned to the human. What happens now? The human's expression was unreadable. That depends on you. Talroth exhaled sharply, running a hand over his face. No one will believe us. The human tilted his head slightly. Then let them find out for themselves. Xyl'Zan closed his eyes. He could already see it. Other fleets, other scientists, other civilizations trying to study what they were never meant to. And one by one, they would disappear. Just like they almost had. Talroth straightened, his usual confidence shaken but not gone. We need to warn them. Xyl'Zan looked at the human again. Will that stop it? The human did not answer immediately. Then he simply said, "You'll find out." Xyl'Zan sat in the command center of the research station, his fingers hovering over the control panel. The station was operational again, as if nothing had happened, as if they had never left. But he knew better. Talroth stood beside him, arms crossed, his gaze flicking toward the human, who had not moved since they returned. "We have to report this," Talroth said, his voice strained. "The Galactic Science Council needs to know what we found." Xyl'Zan didn't respond immediately. His tendrils twitched with hesitation. "You assume they'll believe us," he said finally. "They will," Talroth insisted. "The logs, the anomalies, the data we collected, it's proof." Xyl'Zan turned to look at him. "Proof of what?" he asked. Talroth hesitative. Xyl'Zan continued, his voice quieter. "That we found something beyond our understanding, that we saw something watching us, that our entire perception of the universe is built on a lie." Talroth opened his mouth, then closed it, because that was the real problem. This wasn't about missing data. It was about belief. Even if they told the truth, even if they had all the evidence in the universe, who would accept it? Who would be willing to admit that everything they thought they knew was wrong? The human finally moved, stepping toward the control panel where Xyl'Zan sat. "You're afraid," he said. Xyl'Zan's eyes flicked up at him. "Wouldn't you be?" The human didn't answer immediately. Then he said, "Fear is useful. It keeps people from making mistakes." Talroth scoffed. "You call this a mistake?" The human turned his gaze on him. "You were never meant to look this far beyond the veil. You weren't ready." Talroth clenched his fists. "You keep talking like you know what's going on, like you're different from us." The human studied him for a long moment, then said, "I am." Xyl'Zan's fingers curled over the edges of the control panel. "You knew," he murmured. "From the beginning, you knew we were making a mistake." The human tilted his head slightly. "I suspected. Now I know." "Know what?" Talroth demanded. The human's voice was quiet. "That some doors should never be opened." Despite their doubts, the message was sent. The Galactic Science Council, the most powerful academic and exploratory body in the known universe, responded immediately. Their return transmission was brief. Transmission received. Evidence under review. Do not leave the station until further notice. Xyl'Zan sat back in his chair. "They don't believe us," he muttered. Talroth exhaled sharply. "They want to analyze the data first." Xyl'Zan glanced at the human. "What do you think they'll do?" The human's gaze remained steady. "Exactly what you did," he said. "They'll investigate." Xyl'Zan swallowed. And the human's voice was colder than before. "They'll be noticed." A week passed. The Galactic Science Council dispatched an exploratory fleet to investigate the research station and the region of space surrounding it. Then, without warning, contact was lost. Not just with the fleet, with the entire Science Council. Their homeworld, their relay stations, their entire communication network, gone. The most powerful scientific minds in the galaxy had vanished overnight. And in their place, a single transmission appeared on every galactic frequency. A voice, familiar yet distorted. Some doors should never be opened. The message repeated once, then fell silent. No one knew where it had come from. No one knew who had sent it. But Xyl'Zan and Talroth understood. The warning had come too late. They had tried to share the truth. But the galaxy hadn't been ready. Now it never would be. The galaxy stood in silence. The Galactic Science Council, an institution that had existed for thousands of years, was gone. Not destroyed, not overthrown, simply erased. No distress signals. No signs of battle. No reki. One day they had been there. The next, they had never existed at all. Governments, empires, and civilizations across the known universe struggled to comprehend what had happened. Their greatest minds, their leading scientists, the very foundation of progress and discovery, vanished into nothing. And the only thing left behind was a message. Some doors should never be opened. The words sent waves of fear through every species that heard them, not because they were a threat, but because they were the truth. In response to the event, an emergency meeting was held at the center of the galactic core. Representatives from every major civilization attended, each one bringing their own theories, their own fears. Some believed it was an attack by an unknown force. Others thought it was an elaborate deception. A few suggested that the Science Council had discovered something so dangerous that they had erased themselves to protect the galaxy. None of them were correct. Xyl'Zan and Talroth sat in silence as the council debated, their minds already knowing what would happen next. They had sent the warning. The galaxy had ignored it. Now it was too late. Over the following weeks, more anomalies began to appear. Entire fleets lost in deep space. Planets falling silent, their populations simply gone. Technological failures occurring in civilizations that had never known malfunction. Trade routes became dangerous as ships vanished without explanation. The laws of reality, once constant and understood, were no longer stable. It wasn't war. It wasn't a plague. It was something else, something that had noticed them, and it was coming closer. Xyl'Zan and Talroth found the human where he always was, watching. He had said nothing since the Science Council had disappeared. He had simply observed, as if he already knew what was happening. Talroth, his usual confidence broken, stepped forward. "Tell us the truth." The human did not look at him. "The truth is simple," he said. "You were never alone." Xyl'Zan's voice was barely above a whisper. "Can we stop it?" The human finally turned, his expression unreadable. "No." Silence stretched between them. Talroth clenched his fists. "Then what do we do?" The human's gaze drifted toward the stars outside the station. "Run." Xyl'Zan's stomach tightened. "Where?" The human closed his eyes. "If you're lucky, somewhere it hasn't noticed yet." The weight of his words settled over them. Talroth exhaled, his voice hollow. "And if we're not?" The human finally looked at them again, and for the first time, there was something in his expression that they had not seen before. "Pity. Then you'll understand what happened to the others." The message was sent again, this time across every galactic channel. Some doors should never be opened. But now it didn't matter, because the door had already been opened, and something was stepping through. The final message from the research station came through fragmented signals, half corrupted by interference that no one could explain. A voice, calm and clear, spoke the last words ever transmitted from that place. "You should have left it alone." Then silence, and the station was gone. Not destroyed, not abandoned, gone, like it had never existed at all.